What's up, guys? We got another MMA DFS card to break down here. And if you guys have not already done it, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We recently crossed 100,000 subscribers. So do me a favor, subscribe if you haven't already. Also, like this video. If you have any questions or comments for me, let me know down below in the YouTube comments. I do always check those out. I respond to them. I like the ones that I like. And I mean, even I like some of the ones I don't like. If you guys just show up and call me an idiot and say that I'm wrong about something, I usually find those entertaining and like those anyway. So if you have any thoughts or comments for me, let me know down below. And then also, if you are a Stochastic sub, well, if you're not, you get sign up using the links that we have down below to sign up for our MMA package. That also comes with access to Discord. So you come sweat out the fights and you can ask any questions in Discord as well. One other thing is that NBA season is going to be starting next week. And if you're interested in playing NBA DFS, we've got a promo going on. The promo code is TIPOFF24. And if you sign up for that for just $1, you get access for all of our NBA tools for the first week of the season. And whether you sign up today, tomorrow, or on opening day, you're going to get access to all of our NBA tools through October 29th. So if you want to sign up a couple days in advance, it's not going to shorten the amount of slates that you get exposure to our tools for. So you're going to be getting our NBA core package. It includes our NBA simulations. You could build all your lineups on our site. You could simulate them. We've got our NBA late swap tool. We got player projections, ownership projections, and all of our other simulation tools as well. You get access to that for just $1 with the promo code TIPOFF24. If you do not remember the promo code, here's just a really easy way to do it. The link's down below in the YouTube box. They already have that promo code loaded in. So if you just click on that link and go over to the site, promo code's already there for you. So check that out if you're considering playing NBA, because you're not going to find a better deal than the ability to build lineups, simulate them, player projections, ownership, all that for just $1. Let's talk about MMA, because I know that's what you guys are here for. And let's start with the main event this weekend. That is Anthony Fluffy Hernandez taking on Michel Pereira. And a pretty short fight card here. We've only got 11 fights and then potential for one of them to drop off. Jocelyn Edwards had a really bad weight miss and looked pretty poor getting off the scale as well. So I do think that fight won't end up playing. But for now, because the fight is on, I still have it in my exposures. We'll talk more about that as we go. But starting here with the main event, Anthony Hernandez taking on Michel Pereira. And this is a fight that is going to have a lot of exposure, which is not really any kind of surprise. We've got Anthony Hernandez projected for just under 50% ownership, and then Pereira projected for just under 40% ownership. I'm going to be more so on the Hernandez side. Here's why. So the one thing that's really stood out about Michel Pereira's career, his cardio is not great. Now, in recent fights, it hasn't mattered because he is just sparking dudes immediately. Ihor Potieria knocks him out in chokes him out in 54 seconds. Mikhail Olashechuk, we saw Pereira hurt him to the body, gets to his back, chokes him out in just over a minute. The fight against Andre Petroski knocks him out in a minute. And then before that, we did see some fights that went to decision where he didn't look quite as impressive. Split decision against Santiago Ponzinibbio, a unanimous decision over Andre Fialho. But here's still the thing that concerns me when it comes to Pereira, is that he is somebody who definitely does slow down in the later stages of fights, and oftentimes not even the later stages. Sometimes it's the end of the first round or the second round where he starts to slow down. Part of the reason for that is Pereira's a showman. You'll see him going into the octagon. He's dancing. He's doing backflips. He's breakdancing. And that really showed itself in the Tristan Connolly fight. I know this was a few years ago at this point, but we saw him as a massive favorite against Tristan Connolly. Looked decent in the first round, but he's doing his normal stuff like, spinning stuff. He's doing backflips in the octagon. And what happens is Pereira wins the first round and then just has nothing left in the gas tank and ends up getting himself beat because Connolly wins the second and third rounds. Now, he has definitely improved his fight IQ since then, but I'm still not convinced that Pereira is able to go a full 5 rounds. I don't have any of those concerns about Anthony Hernandez, who there have been no signs of him slowing up in any of his fights. So we've seen Anthony Hernandez oftentimes have to weather a storm in the first round of fights, and that takes place pretty frequently in his outings, like Edmund Shabazian. Shabazian is somebody who's a handful to deal with for the first few minutes, but he typically ends up slowing down, and then it's not much of an issue past the first few minutes. And that's been the case with a lot of these opponents that Anthony Hernandez has gone up against. And typically, after the first couple of minutes, he just wears guys out with his relentless wrestling and grappling pressure. So you see 3 takedowns against Roman Kopylov, 6 against Shabazian, 8 against Marc-Andre Barrio, 8 against Josh Fremd. Against Rodolfo Vieira, while he didn't take Vieira down, he was a massive underdog in that spot, and he was able to gas out Vieira, in the second round. And then he ends up submitting Vieira, who's one of the most credentialed black belts we've ever seen fight in the UFC. So if we do see Hernandez weather the storm that Pereira brings in the first round, I do think we're going to see Hernandez end up winning this fight probably in the second or third round after Pereira ends up getting fatigued. This fight is right in the mid-range. We've got Hernandez at $8,300. We've got Pereira at $7,900. Both of them are popular. I'm going to be overweight to Fluffy Hernandez and coming in underweight to Pereira on the other side. Co-main event, we have Rob Font taking on Kyler Phillips. Massive betting line here. Kyler Phillips is now swollen to a nearly minus 500 favorite. And at first, I thought the line looked a little bit too wide just because we've seen Rob Font against higher levels of competition than Kyler Phillips. Kyler Phillips, also somebody with somewhat of a questionable gas tank. But then I watched back some of Rob Font's recent fights, and this guy just can't defend a takedown. He's older. He's starting to slow down a little bit. And it's not just that he gets taken down a lot. He's not able to get up after he's taken down. So Corey Sandhagen with a bum arm. Corey Sandhagen got hurt right at the start of that fight. He lands 7 takedowns. Rob Font defended none of them successfully. And it's not like Corey Sandhagen's known as some massive wrestling and grappling threat. Corey Sandhagen lands 7 takedowns and is nearly 20 minutes of control time. Basically was just able to take Rob Font down and sit on top of him. And that was Corey Sandhagen fighting with one arm. Then in Corey Sandhagen's Rob Font's next fight against Davison Figueiredo, you have to think that Rob Font's realized, oh, I have this hole in my game. I have to fix it up. And what happens? Figueiredo goes 4 of 7 on takedown attempts. And we don't see Figgy go to his wrestling all that often and has 4 minutes of control time. So Rob Font's not getting any younger. His reaction times are getting slower. And I think that Kyler Phillips should be able to look at the results of Rob Font's last couple of fights and say, wrestle, wrestle, wrestle. Because if this fight takes place on the feet, it's competitive. Kyler Phillips is a much more dynamic striker, but Rob Font is, I'd say, the cleaner boxer of the two. And on the feet, Rob Font is very formidable. But if Kyler Phillips goes to his wrestling, which we've seen him do before, he lands nearly 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, then I think Kyler Phillips wins this fight pretty comfortably. There's a lot of live underdogs on this card. You could see a scenario where Rob Font wins, but he's not somebody I'm going to be taking a lot of shots on. Other spots I will be taking chances on. Kyler Phillips, one of my most exposed favorites on the slate at $9,300. I currently have him about 40% of lineup. So Kyler Phillips, picking him to win. Maybe he's able to get himself a submission over Rob Font, but either way, even if the fight does go to the scorecards, I think Phillips could still score well just because he is most likely to come in with a wrestling and grappling-based game plan after how Rob Font's last couple of fights went. Next fight here, Charles Johnson against Sumudaerji. And Charles Johnson's been making massive improvements in his recent fights. There was an issue with Charles Johnson in terms of defending takedowns earlier in his career. And guys would usually just go out and say, like, hey, if I wrestle against Charles Johnson, I'm probably going to break him down and end up winning. And we saw stuff happen like him get taken down 11 times by Cody Durden, 3 times by Rafael Estevan. We saw him taken down 3 times by Ode Osborne, 12 times by Muhammad Mokaev. And now in his recent fights, we've seen him be able to keep them on the feet more often. Only 1 takedown by Joshua Van, and then Charles Johnson knocked him out in the 3rd round. Jake Hadley didn't take down Charles Johnson. Azat Maxim, who is a very highly hyped prospect going into a fight against Charles Johnson, and Maxim knocked him down like 10 seconds into the fight. Charles Johnson was able to get himself back up, recover, comes back, wins the 2nd and 3rd round to win the fight there. So I really like what we've seen out of Charles Johnson in the last couple of fights. And now he's going up against a guy in Sumudaerji who is going to strike with him. And that's something we almost never see in Charles Johnson fights. Usually guys are looking to take him down, and now he's going to be getting a striker. And I wonder, could we see Charles Johnson himself go to look to wrestle and grapple? Because Charles Johnson is not a terrible offensive wrestler or grappler. He's just not typically in matchups where we see him have to go and utilize it. And Sumudaerji has poor cardio. He's got poor grappling defense. We've seen him submitted before. He defends takedowns at just 66%. So we've seen some matchups where Sumudaerji has looked good early, but then he just gasses out and could get himself finished in the 2nd rounds of fights. Like we saw the fight against Matt Schnell where Sumudaerji was beating the crap out of Matt Schnell. It looked like that fight was going to be stopped. And then all of a sudden, Matt Schnell is able to land a takedown, gets on top, and submits Sumudaerji shortly after. So I think Charles Johnson is more live for a submission than a lot of people might realize for this fight. But then even if it takes place on the feet, I still think that Charles Johnson is the better striker, and I think he has better cardio as well. So he's somebody I like as a pay up option. It's hard to be massively contrarian outside of a couple of spots on this slate, just because with it being a shorter card, kind of everybody is projected for some ownership. But with that said, 30% ownership for Charles Johnson at $8,800. That does make him one of the lower owned pay up options on the entire slate. And he is somebody that I want to be overweight to. Moving on here, the next fight, it is Jake Hadley against Cameron Smotherman. And this is a fight where it's just going to be really hard to ignore Jake Hadley. He's currently now close to a minus 600 favorite. And because there has been a change in opponents, what has happened is Jake Hadley is only $7,700. At the time I'm recording this video, he's the biggest favorite on the entire card. So a $7,700 Jake Hadley at a minus 600 favorite, it is hard to not really like him, especially because he's going up against an opponent in Cameron Smotherman, who really doesn't belong in the UFC. We've seen him fight once in the octagon. It was on the Contender Series. It was against Charlampas Gregorio, who also doesn't really belong in the UFC. And Smotherman got knocked out in a minute in that fight. So I think Jake Hadley is going to have massive advantages here. I think he should win pretty comfortably. And we don't need like 110, 120 fantasy points out of him at only $7,700. You usually need those really big scores from like a minus 600 favorite. So in cash games, Jake Hadley, just kind of a no-brainer. And then even for GPPs, the question becomes, do you want to be over or underweight to Jake Hadley relative to his ownership? We've got him projected for right around 50% ownership. And using our sims here, I got him in 83% of my lineup. So I'm going to be overweight to Jake Hadley. There are spots that I'm going to be different at that I'll be talking about in a little bit. Some of you who are maybe a little bit more clever are looking on the screen right now, and you're seeing low-owned fighters that I'm overweight to. So don't worry, there are some low-owned spots. Kind of like last week, there was a couple of really good spots we were overweight to that ended up making for a really profitable card, like hitting on Brandon Royval and then also hitting on Pat Sabatini. So there are some leverage plays that I'm going to be hitting on in a little bit. But Jake Hadley, I'm just going to be playing the chalk there. Big favorite and somebody who I expect to win. And it's $7,700. Very, very likely to be in the optimal lineup. Darren Elkins against Daniel Pineda. This is a great fight to be targeting for DFS purposes. Both these guys are old at this point. We've got on one side of the fight, Darren Elkins is 40 years old. On the other side of the fight, Daniel Pineda is 39 years old. Darren Elkins has maybe the worst nickname in all of the UFC, as well as the worst tattoo in the UFC. His nickname is The Damage because he absorbs a lot of damage in his fights, which, I mean, is like not that great when you're 40 years old and you've been taking a lot of damage in fights for the last, 20 years or whatever that Darren Elkins has been fighting. So while Elkins has always been somebody who's really resilient and able to absorb a lot of damage, it's not exactly sustainable into your 40s. But then on the other side of the fight, Daniel Pineda has always been a guy who's kind of first round or bust. He either gets himself an early finish or he doesn't. He gasses out and gets himself finished. So in this matchup, I think this is a really good contrast of styles where Daniel Pineda is going to come out very heavy in the first round. And what I think happens here is Pineda either gets Elkins out in the first round or he doesn't. He gasses out miserably. And then Elkins probably finishes him in the second or early portion of the third round. I do lean a little bit more towards the Elkins side of the fight. I think he's a little bit more reliable and trustworthy between the two, but it's not really a strong take. The only strong feeling I have of this fight is the winner is going to score really well for DFS. So I want to be overweight to both sides. I currently have about 40% exposure to Daniel Pineda. My current mark on Darren Elkins in my first run of Sims is just over 30%, but I'm going to up him. So I'll expect ultimately that I'll be somewhere in the 40% range in both Elkins and Pineda, with this fight being in nearly all of my lineups. Whoever wins, I think it should score really well. If you're only playing one lineup, I lean more towards Darren Elkins if you're trying to pick one side of the fight to play. Now moving on to the next fight, we've got Matus Nicolau taking on Asu Almabayev, and a little bit of concerns earlier at the weigh-ins because Nicolau just didn't show up at first. We end up finding out that he was stuck in traffic, which made it so that he missed the weigh-in window, but ended up not being an issue. Got on the scale, made weight. The only issue is that it delayed me recording this video by like 45 minutes or so. But as far as this matchup goes, it's not one I have a mass amount of interest in for DFS. I really like Almabayev as a prospect. Here's the problem, though. He's somebody who has scored well in DFS in the past and profiles to score well in DFS going forward because he implements a really wrestling-heavy game plan. He's landing 6.68 takedowns per 15 minutes. In Almabayev's first few fights in the octagon against Ode Osborne, 2 takedowns, gets himself a second-round submission against CJ Vergara, 9 takedowns and a decision win against Jose Johnson, 6 takedowns and a decision win. But Nicolau is really, really good takedown defense, and this is a big step up in competition for Almabayev. I still think he wins. The biggest issue I have with Nicolau is that while he's very talented, he just doesn't do much. He's somebody who's a very low output striker. He doesn't really have a lot of power to put guys away. So he lands 3.62 strikes per minute, and then he lands 1.38 takedowns per 15 minutes. He also has really strong takedown defense, defends 93% of the takedowns that come his way. He's actually only been taken down once ever in the UFC. I believe that was by Tim Elliott. And yeah, Tim Elliott took him down once in 2021. And that's the only time we've ever seen Nicolau floor during his time in the UFC. So what I think is probably going to happen in this fight is I think Almabayev is going to be able to push Nicolau up against the cage, and then he's going to attempt a lot of takedowns. Maybe he lands a couple over the course of the fight, but it's hard for me to see him just rinse and repeat takedowns against a guy who's a veteran Nicolau with 93% career takedown defense. So what I think happens is I think Almabayev wins the decision, but it's probably going to be really low output and a lot of octagon control involved. So I'm going to pick Almabayev to win, pick him to win by decision, but there's other fights that I prefer to be targeting on the card. Next up, we have Brad Katona taking on Gene Matsumoto, and Matsumoto is a very good athlete, and he's an interesting prospect with one big hole in his game, and that is that he defends takedowns at a 56% clip. So in the last fight that we saw Gene Matsumoto fight, he won. He submitted Dan Argueta in the second round, but prior to the submission, Dan Argueta took him down 9 times. And now you got a fighter in Brad Katona who's difficult to finish, has crazy good cardio. He doesn't fight at like the highest striking pace in the world, but he is able to keep up a pretty good wrestling pace. So we've seen Brad Katona land numerous takedowns in a lot of his fights. He just had 3 takedowns against Jesse Butler. He had 4 takedowns and a loss to Garrett Armfield. The fight against Cody Gibson, that was the Ultimate Fighter finale of the season they were on. Katona won. That was just a war, but kind of an outlier for what we typically see out of Katona fights. He took down Hunter Azure 3 times. The only guy we haven't really seen Katona take down was Merab Dvalishvili, but that's pretty understandable that Merab won the wrestling exchanges. They're the current champion. So in this matchup between Katona and Matsumoto, Matsumoto is going to be fairly popular. Katona isn't. And when you consider that Katona is capable of wrestling offensively, I think this is our first real leverage play on the slate. Matsumoto just getting taken down 9 times in a fight, defending takedowns at a 56% clip. I like Brad Katona on a small slate at only 18% ownership as someone to be overweight to the field to and differentiate some of our lineups. Matsumoto, I do think, is probably a little bit more likely to win the fight, probably by decision, but just in the interest of trying to find where can we get underdogs that are live to win and could potentially score well in a win, that's where I think Brad Katona profiles well at just 18% projected ownership on a smaller slate. Jocelyn Edwards taking on Tamara's Vidal, and Jocelyn Edwards, massive weight miss. She initially missed weight by 3.5 pounds, then she cut all her hair off, and then she was over by 3 pounds as opposed to 3.5 pounds. But she looked really rough on the scales. My best guess is this fight ends up getting canceled either later on Friday after I'm done recording or maybe Saturday morning. Even if the fight does go through, though, it's hard for me to have a ton of confidence in this fight because neither of these fighters, neither Vidal or Edwards, are typically great DraftKings scorers. And then in addition to that, Edwards, who I do think should be able to win the fight, we have seen her look to wrestle a little bit more in recent fights, and Vidal only with 28% takedown defense. We've seen Tamara's Vidal taken down 3 times by Montserrat Rondon. She was taken down twice by Melissa Gatto. So with that being in mind, I do think that if Edwards looks to shoot takedowns, she probably gets them, probably holds a bunch of top control time. But once she lands the takedowns, I don't think Vidal is getting back up. I think she's just going to kind of be stuck on the bottom, and then just not all that much is going to happen. So if the fight does take place, I pick Edwards to win by decision. But I think the most likely outcome is probably this fight ends up getting canceled. And either way, it's a fight that I don't really want all that much exposure to. Few fights left here to talk about. Jessica Penne taking on Elise Reed, and Jessica Penne is another very older veteran fighter. She's 41 years old. The one good thing about her is that we know what her game plan always is. She's looking to wrestle, she's looking to get on top, and then she's looking to submit her opponents. And we know what Elise Reed's weakness is. She has 42% takedown defense, so another favorite that doesn't really defend takedowns all that well. And here's typically how Elise Reed fights go. If her opponent looks to wrestle against her, she gets taken down, and then she either gets submitted or she gets stuck on the bottom and loses the decision. Lupi Godinez in her last fight took down Elise Reed 5 times, also knocked her down once, and we got a second-round submission out of Loopy. Against Jinyu Fry, this was a pretty close decision, but a non-inspiring performance. Jinyu Fry took down Elise Reed 3 times. Loma Luke Boomy, she took down Elise Reed twice and submitted her. Melissa Martinez, who's also fighting on this card, we'll be talking about her in a second. She is more of a striking-based fighter, didn't really look to wrestle. Actually, Elise Reed landed 3 takedowns in that fight, so Elise Reed won that one. And then we also saw Sam Hughes beat Elise Reed, took her down 4 times, then finished her in the 3rd round. So I think this line is a little bit too wide. And Elise Reed's also pretty expensive on DraftKings. She is $8,600 and still projected for 26% ownership. Just because the path to victory is so clear for Jessica Penne, and it's a path to victory that typically scores well, I like the Penne side of the fight. It's hard to trust her at 41 years old, but once again, the field's trusting Elise Reed when the field's playing her in 26% of lineups. So I'm going to take underdog shots on Jessica Penne. She's only projected for 17% ownership. I want to be a little bit over 20%. It's not like a massive stand on the 41-year-old Penne, but I do think a Penne win scores better than an Elise Reed win. Penne is cheaper and she's lower owned. So that's another contrarian play on the slate to differentiate some lineups. Couple fights left here. Next one on the card, it is Melissa Martinez against Alice Ardelean. And I don't really have a ton of interest in this fight. Melissa Martinez is favored. I think that she should be favored. But this is another one of these situations where she is not somebody who has very good takedown defense. I know I feel like I'm repeating myself. We've got a favor with poor takedown defense, but that's just kind of what a lot of these fights look like on paper. We've seen Melissa Martinez fight once in the UFC, and Elise Reed, who we just talked about how poor Elise Reed's ground game is, Elise Reed went 3 of 3 on takedown attempts against Melissa Martinez. I believe that 3 of 3. So Melissa Martinez has 0% takedown defense for her career because she's fought against Elise Reed, and Elise Reed landed 3 of 3 takedowns against her. And Ardelean, who is not good at all, I don't think she belongs in the UFC. We just saw her loss against Shauna Bannon, which was not really a great fight. But what did she look to do in that fight? She looked to wrestle. We saw her land 2 takedowns, and she attempted 4. And I think she has to be looking at this matchup and saying wrestling is the path to victory. Ardelean also took that fight on short notice, so maybe her cardio will look better this time out because she did look okay in the early going against Shauna Bannon, but then she ended up gassing out. So now we're going to be getting her with a full camp in a fight against, not that Shauna Bannon's a great opponent either, but Melissa Martinez is probably even a slight step down in competition. I'll slightly favor Melissa to win just because of that. I think that she is the better striker, and I don't have all that much confidence in Ardelean's ability to go a full 3 rounds, but she should look marginally better than she did in her last fight. And if we're looking for upside in between these two fighters, a Melissa Martinez win is going to be a low output striking-based decision. With Ardelean wins, it's probably going to be coming via takedowns and some control time. So I'll pick Martinez to win, but not with all that much conviction. But clearly the better DFS play is going to be the Ardelean side for the wrestling upside. Now, finally, the last fight, first fight on the card, last one that I'm breaking down, it's Robles Despaigne taking on Austin Lane. And I think this is one of the best overall fights to be targeting on the slate. Despaigne is going to be super popular. And then on the comeback, Austin Lane only project for 8% ownership. He is expected to be, in our data, the lowest owned fighter on the entire card. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be getting exposure to Austin Lane because he's capable of wrestling. We saw him against Jonathan Diaz in his last fight. He looked terrible past the first round, but in the first round of that fight, pull up the stats here, Austin Lane gets a takedown immediately at the start of the first round, has north of 4 minutes of control time, nearly got a finish, outlands Diaz 35 strikes to just 5. A lot of them was not like the most powerful strikes from Austin Lane, but top control, some ground and pound there. And if that first round lasted a little bit longer, I think we could have seen Austin Lane get himself a finish there. And now he's got kind of a similar matchup against Robles Despaigne because Despaigne also has zero ability to defend takedowns, and he is very dependent on getting himself knockouts. We saw against Waldo Cortez Acosta. Acosta landed 3 takedowns. He had nearly 10 minutes of control time. He outlands Despaigne 130 strikes to 28. So Austin Lane is definitely not as good as Waldo Cortez Acosta, but he is capable of implementing that same sort of game plan. The question becomes will Austin Lane be able to get the fight finished in the first round? And if he doesn't, does he just totally death gas like he did in his last fight against Diaz, which is probably the most likely scenario. But with that said, the ownership gap, it is way too wide here. Despaigne is 44% owned and only at 8% ownership on Austin Lane. So for an 11-fight card, you have a fighter at $6,800 who's 8% owned that has a clear path to victory. And the path to victory is what we've seen him implement in other fights. So Despaigne should be favored to win. I also think the betting line is too wide, though. So I think Austin Lane is worth looking at first-round submission props. Maybe you could just bet him to win in the first round because you also might be able to win by ground and pound. So even though Despaigne, I think, should be favored, I think the line is too wide, and I think the field is way too heavy on one side of the fight versus the other for DFS purposes. So I'm going to be taking a lot of shots on Austin Lane and GPPs, only project for 8% ownership. I currently have him in 28% of lineups. It doesn't mean I'm writing off Despaigne. I still have him in 40% of my lineups because if Austin Lane is not able to get Despaigne out of there in the first round, well, then I think Despaigne is either going to knock out Austin Lane in the later stage of the first round or maybe the start of the second round. So I think a really good fight to be targeting for DFS. I'm going to be about even with the field on Despaigne and coming in way overweight to the field in a leverage play in Austin Lane. So that is going to do it for us today, guys. Broke down the entire card. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below in the YouTube comments. I'm going to be checking those out. I'll be reading them, see what you guys have to say. If you're playing NBA DFS, don't forget to sign up for our NBA tools this year. It's just $1 if you're looking to try it out for the first week of the season. Promo code TIPOFF24. Have a great weekend, guys. Good luck with the card. See you back here next week. Next week's card is going to be awesome. We've got Max Holloway taking on Ilia Topuria in the main event. We've got also Khamzat Chimaev, hopefully he shows up, taking on Robert Whitaker in the co-main event. So you're going to want to check out next week's card for sure. Other than that, peace out, guys. See you back here next week.